Hello and welcome to the National Secular Society podcast. You are listening to Part 8 in our series of interviews exploring religious freedom. I'm Alastair Lichten, Head of Education at the NSS, and in this series I'm speaking to a variety of activists and experts about what religious freedom means to them, what are its limits and how might it be abused. Today I spoke with Izzy Posen, a speaker at our upcoming conference, Secularism 2019. I'll let Izzy introduce himself and I'll be back at the end with a few closing thoughts. Enjoy. Izzy Posen, welcome to the NSS podcast.
Hi, good morning, Alastair. I'm very happy to be here.
Cheers. Maybe you can start by introducing yourself and your story to the audience.
Sure. So my name is Izzy Posen. I grew up in East London in an area called Stamford Hill, which is in Hackney. People who have walked past the area or drove past the area would notice that it's an area heavily populated by a specific community of ultra-Orthodox Jews known as Chasidic Jews. They're recognizable by distinctive dress and distinctive customs. They also largely speak Yiddish, not English. So I grew up there. I attended schools there until the age of 20. Most of the schools I attended were illegal schools, and that's what I'm going to be talking about at the conference. And we didn't have any secular education. We didn't learn any English. We didn't learn any maths or any science. We just spent the whole day studying Jewish Orthodox texts. We were also hit in school, and other unsavory and unpleasant things happened to us. Throughout my teens, I started questioning some of the religious dogma, and I wanted to expand my horizons. So I taught myself English. I started reading a little bit of science and maths, and eventually, by the time I was 20, through my getting to learn science and starting to have a more critical view on the Jewish dogma I was taught, I came to lose my faith. I left the community and started life outside of the community, which was very challenging, and I'll be talking about that as well. And I eventually, when I left at 20, I had to my GCSEs and A levels because I had no qualifications. And 3 years later, I was in university where I'm currently studying. I do physics and philosophy. I'm in second year. I also started the Bristol Free Speech Society here at university, so people can have rigorous discussions about sensitive and difficult topics, because I believe ultimately that is the point of heresy. It's not only about questioning religious dogma, it's questioning all dogma. So this is where I am now.
Well, and thank you. And I think that story will be inspiring to anyone who's faced educational been pushed back and had to, build up themselves and overcome difficulties. Given your experiences, what does religious freedom mean to you?
Religious freedom means to me the idea that people have the freedom to choose what they believe and how to express their beliefs, and it applies both to religion and to secular people. So, as we like to say in secular circles, freedom of religion means also freedom from religion. So it's freedom of association, freedom of thought, and it's the idea that it shouldn't be what we believe and what we think shouldn't be top down. It should be bottom up. So people should be able to go out there, explore, question things, come up with their own ideas, and believe what they want. Well, of course, as long as it's not dangerous, not violent, believe what they want, and come to design their own life based on their own ideas and their own worldviews.
Conversations about freedom of/from religion often overlook when religion is being imposed on members of the community by the wider community, rather than, I think we all sort of recognize the problem when one person's religion is being imposed on someone who doesn't share that religion. But when you have the religious community, but there's that top-down imposition within the community of their religious ideas, that's often not seen as a freedom of and from religion issue. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's actually a quite complex issue. It's not. People like to see it as simple. Freedom is freedom, but actually, people's freedoms clash. We philosophers have been grappling with this issue since times of antiquity. People's freedoms clash. My freedom to do something can often clash with yours. Take a radical example, which is almost absurd, but it shows the problem. If I want to say I have the freedom to do anything, including slapping you, then I'm infringing of your freedom of not being slapped. Now, the solution is, well, use your freedom, but not to infringe on my freedoms. Well, the problem is, how do you define my freedoms and your freedoms, and what happens when they overlap? So, a classical example, which we're seeing now in schools, which is a very topical issue at the moment, is religious communities will say that people coming into schools and teaching acceptance of minorities, of LGBT people, is infringing on their religious freedoms. Well, the LGBT community will say actually kids growing up not knowing that LGBT people exist infringes, well, both on their freedoms as a community to feel safe in this country, and also on the potential freedoms of the kids growing up who by law of large numbers and by percentages are some of them are likely gay. So the question is not so much, should we have religious freedom, which I think everyone agrees with. The question is where to draw the lines, and it is a complex question.
What can people who are not part of specific religious communities, and here I'm particularly thinking of ultra-conservative religious communities, and if you're not from that background, what can you do to support people in your position or your former position?
So there are various charitable organizations set up to help people who leave communities. Now, I want to point out that these are absolutely vital. People who leave very restrictive communities, like myself, they absolutely need outsiders' help. They're told all their life that there is no life outside of the community, and they won't make it, and they're not given the skills to make it outside the community. And in my own case, if not for a charity called Mavar, so it's a Jewish charity set up to help ex-Haredi, ex-ultra-Orthodox Jews. If not for them, I would not have been able to make it out. So I think the first thing that secular people can do is help and support these charities. These charities need money to help people leave. They need volunteers to, basic things as teaching people English, teaching people about relationships. I grew up in a community where since the age of 13, I wasn't allowed to speak with any women. And leaving that into the world, we need mentorship. We need to be taught effectively how to make it in the secular world. So these charities rely a lot on volunteers and on donations. So that's, I think, a really good way in which people can help these communities. There's another charity that I know in the wider community called Faith to Faithless. I know the director. He's a friend of mine, and that's also a fantastic charity that people can help.
When someone has missed out on a basic education as a result of being in a specific very narrow community, does the state have a responsibility to then to make sure that they do get that right to education later in life?
Oh, I wish that was the case. I mean, if only the government would pay for my education that I had to do later than everyone. That would be fantastic, and I wouldn't be in so much debt as I am now. I assume to make that come about would need significant lobbying. And I don't think the community of ex-fundamentalist religious people is large enough to make that happen. But I would say yes. And I know there are cases. I know in Canada, a friend of mine who grew up in a Chasidic education system, and he didn't get an education. He is suing the state, and he's effectively saying, look, you had a responsibility to protect my rights as a kid. You didn't. I didn't get an education. Now I'm suing you for the damage. First of all, give me an education. And secondly, I've gone many years without being able to find a job because I don't have skills. Compensate me for that. And I think that's a decent argument. The case is still going on, and I'm very curious to see what the outcome is. But I do think, and this is myself and fellow ex-community members do feel let down by the local authorities, because the local authorities have known for decades that thousands of Stanford kids are missing from the radar. They're not registered in any schools, and they're not being homeschooled. And they didn't do anything to prevent that. So it's not entirely their fault. It's the community's fault as well. But as local authorities who need to protect kids, they should make sure that kids get an education, a basic education, and they failed with regards to myself and my friends. So should the government make sure we get an education late in life? I'd love to see that happen. I don't think it's realistically going to happen.
I mean, because I've seen local authorities that say just because a child is going to an illegal, unregistered school doesn't mean that they're not receiving a suitable education. And I suspect one aspect of this may be that if you have thousands of children, or potentially tens of thousands spread over local authorities who are attending illegal, unregistered schools, if the local authority were to take strong action on that, then they suddenly have the responsibility and they don't have the school capacity to take on the numbers of the children who have previously just been slipping through the net.
Well, that's why we have local authorities, and that's why we have governments, and that's why governments have money to do the things they are obliged to do by law. I don't think it's an excuse that it would be difficult for them. Yes, it would be difficult. That's why they're powerful. That's why they're governments, to do difficult things.
Is there a danger in tackling some of the problems we're seeing in very conservative, independent faith schools? This is registered legal ones, that we might end up driving more people into the illegal, unregistered sector, or simply just not getting any education at all?
Yes, there is, and this needs to be approached very carefully. I'm by no means an expert. All I know is my own experience of attending an illegal school and being a member of the community. So I know how the community thinks in this regard, and it's important that governmental bodies and local authorities who deal with these issues are intimately familiar with the ways of thinking, so they don't misstep. And for example, one way in which the community thinks in this regard is they have this vision, which is rooted in ancient mythology going back thousands of years, of their community, of the God-fearing Jews as being a force of good in the world, persecuted by the forces of evil. And the forces of evil are anyone who interferes with their way of life. And they have this. So, for example, Hanukkah is a festival that all Jews celebrate, but ultra-Orthodox Jews have a narrative around it. So the narrative is that there were these evil Greeks who tried to Hellenize the Jews in Israel, and their interpretation of Hellenizing is that make sure that Jews no longer serve their God in the way they see fit. And the story of Hanukkah for them is that the Jews fought back and won, and the way they fought back is by being uncompromising and by carrying on in their way of life and their observances. And fighting back against a mighty army. And the message they take out from this story is that there's always people who want to interfere with our way of worshipping God, and we fight back, and God helps us, and we win. And this is exactly the narrative they have towards governmental bodies like Ofsted and the Department of Education. They see any interference by Ofsted as these evil forces trying to secularize the Jews, trying to make them no longer be observant in the way they see fit, and they are very, very stubborn in fighting back, and nothing stops them, and no tactics are out of bound. They when it comes to these things, usually they're law-abiding citizens, but when it comes to these things, when they perceive threat to their religious observances, there is no law. There's nothing is out of bounds. And yes, you're right. They will get. It can drive people to become more extremists. It can drive more schools underground. But the question then is, this doesn't mean that government should give up. This doesn't mean that we should turn a blind eye. All it does mean is that we should be very sensitive and very careful in how to address these issues. So the government needs to be clear that it does not want to interfere with their observances, with their ways of religious practice. It does not want to secularize them. All it wants is that kids get some form of secular education. Now, this is very difficult for two reasons. First of all, that for many within the ultra-Orthodox community, even spending time in the day to get a secular education is in itself against the religious faith. So there's an idea within ultra-Orthodox Judaism that boys need to dedicate every second of their day to the study of the Torah, the religious law, and spending time on secular education is against the faith. Now, so this means that inherently the second the government asks for basic secular education, they're already the community is already up in arms. A second problem is that, of course, we know that there are other things besides for basic secular education that we want kids to know, the so-called British values. So we want kids to grow up in the country, to not think that the rest of the country is evil, to be able to interact with people outside the community, and to know that there are people different to them, to get to know people from different faiths, from different sexual orientations. And this is directly, at least they perceive it that way, a direct affront to their ways of life. So, for example, the Haredi community is now up in arms against the Department of Education against Ofsted for requiring that they teach relationship and sexuality classes. And we know with this, the fights in Birmingham between the Muslim community and schools has made it into the news. But the ultra-Orthodox fights have not so much made it into the news, but they go and gone at the very same time, at this very moment. There are big rabbinical councils being set up and discussing what can we do. So I don't think there's a simple solution. This is a conflict that's always going to be there. Unfortunately, I have nothing to offer in terms of a solution. All I can say is that we can't ignore it. It's a problem. And we need to think. I mean, when I say we, I mean the government or the governmental bodies need to sit and think and consult the community and consult people who left the community, who know the community, and figure out the best strategy forward. But as I said, I don't think there's a simple solution.
In a blog of mine, I called this weaponized unreasonableness. And if you start by making yourself deliberately unreasonable, then if you start from the point of view that anything is an infringement on your religion, then it's very difficult to find some sort of compromise.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing you spoke about earlier about, freedom of religion, freedom from religion, and I said that if freedoms overlap, freedoms clash. This is a perfect example because on the one hand, part of being a liberal democracy is the idea that people can practice their religions freely. But in order for that to function, we also need people to agree that others can practice their religion freely and to buy into the basic premise of liberal democracy. So what do you do when you have communities for whom their idea of religion is the negation of liberal democracy? This is Karl Popper, the 20th century philosophy, called this the paradox of tolerance. How do you tolerate those who don't tolerate you? You want to be tolerant. You want to tolerate everyone. But then there are people who don't want to tolerate you. So do you tolerate them to allow them to not tolerate you? And I think this is what's happening. So there are religious communities whose basic premise is anti-liberal and anti-democratic, and they expect a liberal democracy to protect their rights to be anti-democratic and anti-liberal. And at some point, there's going to be a clash here. And the difficult question we need to figure out as a society is where we draw the lines. Where do we say, well, we can no longer tolerate that? That's against our basic values. And where do we say, you know what? Yes, go ahead. We don't like it, but it's your right.
Yeah, and that is, I think, the crisis of liberalism and the constant back and forth and trying to find that correct balance. I mean, take parental rights. I don't think it'd be possible to have any sort of liberal, pluralistic, secular democracy that didn't respect parents' rights to raise their children in accordance with their beliefs in a broad sense. But if you look at one end of the sort of a scale between, raising your children in a faith tradition and complete 100% indoctrination, there's got to be somewhere along that line where the balance of rights tips too far one way or the other. If a parent's taking their child to synagogue, that I think it'd be almost impossible to argue that was infringing on the child's rights, the child's independent rights, and to prevent that would be definitely infringing on the parents' rights. If you lock them in a cupboard under stairs all day and only let them read, only let them read the Torah for 24 hours a day, that we'd all agree that's too far. But there needs to be sort of somewhere along between those 2 points where the balance begins to tip. Is it possible to draw a definitive line, or is it just a constant spectrum?
Right. Yeah. No, I absolutely agree, and I'm skeptical about the possibility of drawing a clear line. It might be a very wiggly line, drawing around arbitrary cases. But I mean, I was brought up to believe that if you deviate from the commandments, you go to hell, right? And hell is literal hellfire, and it's pain, and kids are taught about hell in the gory details, right? Now, I would argue that that is child abuse. That is psychological child abuse. You're telling a young child, that if they don't follow exactly what the adults tell them, then they're going to be tortured. How is that not child abuse? But on the other hand, how can you possibly enforce that? How can you make sure, let's assume it was illegal to tell children that, they're going to be tortured in hell. I think it should be. But how are you possibly going to enforce that? How can you make sure that the parent doesn't, in the privacy of their own home, teach that to kids? But yeah, there are many, many other examples.
And if you were to enforce that, you would be imposing potentially a far greater illiberalism through that.
I don't know. I definitely think there should be some things that should be illegal to tell your kids. I mean, if you, we know, for example, parents can't tell the kids that they have a duty to kill unbelievers, right? That would be against the law. And I think, as you said, it is a spectrum, but I think that some forms of harmful indoctrination should be, I don't know if it should be illegal because you can't enforce it, but we should be very suspicious of them. And I don't think parents should have the right to bring up their kids that way.
I guess it's partly that we're changing. There was a time that we viewed parents as the property of I was going to say property of their parents, but really the property of their fathers. And we've evolved and changed that view, and we're moving towards a view of children as independent right holders. But that does mean that you are going to get a clash of rights, and you're going to get sort of messy issues, and where do we draw and not just one where to draw the line question, but thousands of where do we draw the line questions.
Absolutely, and I think society figures this out as it goes along, and society evolves. I mean, at one point we used to think that slaves are property of the owners, right? And then a big shock came when government told people you can't do with your slaves whatever you want. In fact, you can't even have slaves to begin with. And I assume, I don't know, but I assume people must have thought of that in the same shock as people might think nowadays, when they're told that kids are not their property. People may have said, "What do you mean? This family of slaves have been in my family for generations. Of course, they're ours." Right? And I think when we move to a perception of viewing kids not as property but as people with independent rights, I assume there's going to be the same shock. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to, if we evolve as a society in that direction, that's what we're going to have to say, that yes, kids do not belong to their. I mean, parents have a right to educate their kids, but kids are not property of their parents.
Can there be any sort of reconciliation between ultra-conservative religious communities and secularists or genuine advocates of religious freedom?
No, they can't. The very inherent idea behind ultra-conservatism is that people don't have a right to live the way they want, and to choose their own beliefs. Ultra-conservatives are very dogmatic in their beliefs. They believe with absolute certainty in whatever they believe, and whatever God they believe, whatever faith they believe in. And they don't believe in that kind of choice. They believe that, God created you. You have to follow God. And if you don't follow God, you're a heretic. And there's a spectrum. What do you do with a heretic? So in some Islamist communities, they believe you literally have to kill a heretic. Fortunately, in my community, they didn't believe that they should kill heretics. They believe God will do the work for them. But they do believe that they don't believe in choice. When I left my community, nobody said, "Well, you know what, just leave. It's your choice." They said, "You can't. You're going to hell. You're a sinner. You're an apostate." And I think that clash is always going to be there with secularism, because the very idea behind secularism, and by the way, I use secularism broadly. Secularism you can be a religious secularist, right? Secularism is the idea that is this very idea that people choose their beliefs and that people live the way they want to live. And most religious people, I would argue, are secularists in that sense. Most religious people, well, at least liberal religious people would say that the government should be secular, there should be separation between church and state, and so on. But when you come to ultra-conservatives' religion, they reject the very premise of secularism. And I don't see how there can be reconciliation there.
Is there no way to sort of just kind of crack that barrier and begin to open that conversation through the route of, say, well, you don't want other people's religion imposed on you, so in return for not having others' religion imposed on you, we're going to take away your ability to impose yours on other people. And I mean, certain ultra-Orthodox religious communities, to be fair, have no interest in imposing their religion on outsiders. And would even say that, of course, it'd be wrong to impose, say, ultra-Orthodox Judaism on people who are non-Jews, but it should be imposed on people who are.
Right. So that's not so much a matter of them being, more open and more secularists and more liberal and progressive, that they don't want to impose their religion on others. It's a question of dogma. So Jews don't believe that. This is quite different. This is where Judaism differs quite a bit from Christianity and Islam. Judaism doesn't believe that everyone should be Jewish, right? Where Christianity, from what I understand, does believe that everyone should be Christian and believe in Christ. And I think to some extent Islam also believes in proselytizing in that way, maybe to a less extent. But Judaism doesn't believe in proselytizing. Judaism doesn't believe that everyone should be Jewish. Judaism, well, at least when I say Judaism, I mean Orthodox Judaism, believes that every Jew has to be observant. So when it comes to imposing beliefs, ultra-Orthodox Jews definitely and absolutely want to impose their beliefs on other Jews. So, for example, Israel, the current state of Israel, is a secular state. It was founded by atheist Jews. But there's a growing ultra-Orthodox community, and they absolutely want to impose their religion on others. They lobby the government to make sure that motorways are closed on the Sabbath, on the rest day. And they lobby the government to make sure that restaurants have to be kosher and that marriage is done through the rabbinate, the rabbinical council. So they absolutely want to impose their beliefs on others. It's just a matter of dogma, an accidental matter of dogma, that they don't believe that non-Jews ought to be Jews. But in general, the view is not secularist. The view is one of imposing views on others. And the argument you made, which sounds reasonable to most of us, the argument that look, you don't want others to impose their views on you, then don't impose yours on others. This argument makes sense from our perspective as secularists, because we don't believe that the dogma in question is true to begin with. But imagine me being, and this isn't imagine, I've had these discussions with people, and this is what they say. They say, well, I don't want others to impose their views on me because those said views are false, right? So I don't want false views imposed on me. But I do want to impose my views on others because my views are the truth, right? So when you deal with dogmatic sets of beliefs, and by dogma I mean people who think that their views and their views only are the truth, then for them there's an asymmetry here. Other views are false, therefore I don't want them imposed. So Jews will tell you, I don't want Christianity imposed on me because Christianity is false, but I absolutely do want my brand of Judaism imposed on other Jews because my brand of Judaism is true. So this argument fails for a dogmatic mind.
Well, Izzy, thanks so much for your time. And before you go, we always like to ask our guests, are there any books or films that do a good job of exploring religious freedom that you'd like to recommend?
So there's one book that comes to mind immediately. It's a book written by a fellow ex-Chasidic Jew called Shulam Din. It's called All Who Go Do Not Return. He chronicles his upbringing in a Hasidic community in Brooklyn, New York, and how he left. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and he's a really good writer as well. In terms of films, there is a good series, but unfortunately it's in Hebrew. It's on Netflix now with English subtitles, actually, so if people want to watch that, they can watch that. It's called Shtisel. It's not about people leaving the faith per se, but it's about ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, and it's very enlightening on the culture. If people want to watch that, it's very accurate, and it gets the nuances right, which is quite rare on TV. There's also an amazing Netflix show called One of Us, which chronicles the journey of 3 young Hasidic Jews leaving their community. It unfortunately has quite a tragic ending where all 3 end up in quite difficult circumstances due to the community shunning them. So I just point out that caution is needed, that some people make the journey successfully and are very happy, but that is a case, more sadder case, an unfortunate case.
Okay. Well, we'll have links to all those in the show notes. Izzy, thanks so much, and we look forward to seeing you at the conference.
Looking forward as well.
Well, listeners, I hope you found that interesting. People like Izzy who have made a journey from one religious community to another or in or out of such a community often have these unique insights. There'll be links to the organisations and films Izzy mentioned in the show notes, and we'll also have links to our work challenging illegal unregistered faith schools and abuses within registered independent faith schools. Some of the investigations make for shocking reading. Before we go, I want to give Secularism 2019 a last plug. This is our major upcoming conference at the Tower Hotel in central London on Saturday 18th of May. If you haven't booked your ticket yet or are undecided, let me give you a few reasons to come. Firstly, you can hear more from Izzy and our internationally esteemed lineup of speakers, including our keynote address from Rachel Laser, CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and my guest on episode 2 of the podcast. For a full-day conference with lunch, refreshments and awards ceremony, all in a premier venue, you'll be hard-pressed to find better value for money. Student tickets are £10, LSS members can get a ticket for just £25, and even non-member tickets are great value at £50. We will start to run out of tickets soon, so please visit secularism.org.uk/2019, and I hope we'll see you there. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. If you hated it, please share it with an enemy, and if you're in between, maybe listen again. Seriously though, if you want to support the NSS, our campaign's work and future podcasts, please consider joining or donating today at secularism.org.uk/join. Until next time, I'm Alastair Lichten, thanking you for listening. Goodbye.